Christmas morning, my 6-year-old daughter walked into the kitchen wearing earrings I'd never bought her, and for about 3 seconds my brain just refused to make sense of what I was seeing. Small gold studs, one in each ear, catching the light from the tree we decorated 2 nights before, and she touched her left ear like it hurt, and asked if I liked them because Grandma said I would. My stomach dropped so fast I had to grip the counter. I kept staring at her ears, trying to make the pieces fit together, but nothing was connecting right, and those weren't clip-ons, and they weren't stickers, and they definitely weren't something I'd agreed to. She was waiting for me to say something, and I couldn't get my mouth to work because I was still trying to understand how this had happened without me knowing, and my hands were shaking, so I pressed them flat against the counter edge. She touched the left one again, gentle and careful, and she winced just slightly, and they were real, and someone had actually pierced her ears, and I had no memory of giving permission for it, and my brain kept looping back to that fact, like it was stuck on repeat. I asked when she got them, and my voice came out strange and too quiet, and she said yesterday, during the outing with Grandma to see the Christmas lights, and she said it like it was the best surprise in the world. Grandma had told her it was a special Christmas gift, and that all the girls in Daddy's family get their ears pierced at 6 years old, and she'd said I would love them because they were so pretty. I crouched down so I was at her level and tried to keep my face normal, even though my hands were still shaking, and I asked if they hurt, and she nodded just a little and said Grandma told her that was normal and that she had to turn them every day so they wouldn't get stuck. My mother-in-law had taken my daughter somewhere and made a change I couldn't reverse, and I was only finding out about it now, a full day later, on Christmas morning when I couldn't react the way I wanted to because my kid was standing right there, looking proud and happy. I kept replaying yesterday in my head, trying to figure out when it had happened and how I'd missed the signs, but I'd been wrapping last-minute gifts and finishing dinner prep. I just trusted that a quick trip to see lights was exactly that. I told my daughter the earrings looked very nice and asked her to go play with her new toy from Santa, and she skipped off toward the living room, humming something from the radio. The second she was out of sight, I stood up and pressed both palms flat on the counter because I needed something solid under my hands, and my jaw was clenched, so tight, my teeth hurt. I could hear my mother-in-law in the other room unwrapping something and humming along to the Christmas music, perfectly calm, perfectly relaxed, and that sound made something hot rise up in my throat. She'd done this, and she'd taken my kid and pierced her ears, and now she was sitting in my living room drinking coffee like it was just another holiday morning. I'd told her no, and I'd told her more than once, actually, and the last time I'd even sent it in a text message so there wouldn't be any confusion or room for misunderstanding. No piercings, no cosmetic changes. My daughter would decide for herself when she was older, and I'd been clear about it, and I thought that was enough, but apparently it wasn't. Now I had to figure out what to do about that, while also keeping Christmas from falling apart. I walked into the living room before I could second-guess it, and she set her coffee mug down and started talking about how adorable the earrings looked, and how she'd taken my daughter to the same place she'd taken my daughter, to the same place she'd taken my husband's sister. 20 years ago. And she said it was tradition like that explained everything, like tradition was permission. I said she'd pierced my daughter's ears, and it came out flat, no question in it, just the fact hanging there between us. And she said, of course she had, and her tone was so casual, it made my skin prickle. All the women in the family get their ears pierced at 6, and she wasn't going to let my daughter miss out just because I was being overly cautious. The word cautious landed wrong, and I knew she'd chosen it carefully, but I couldn't focus on that yet, because I was still stuck on the fact that she'd actually done this, and I told her I'd said no, and she waved one hand like she was brushing away smoke. She said she knew I'd said that, but she also knew I worried too much about things, and my daughter had wanted the earrings anyway, so she'd made it easy for everyone by just handling it. My daughter had been asking questions because she's 6 years old, and 6-year-olds ask questions about everything. But somehow those questions had turned into consent, in my mother-in-law's mind, and I couldn't tell if she actually believed that, or if she was just pretending to. I heard my husband coming down the stairs, and I knew I had maybe 10 seconds before this turned into something bigger and messier, and my mother-in-law picked up her coffee again and took a sip, completely unbothered, and said I'd thank her later once I calmed down and saw how nice everything looked. I didn't feel calm, and I didn't feel grateful, and I also didn't know how to explain that this wasn't about the earrings being pretty or the piercing being professional. It was about the fact that she'd looked at my boundary and decided it didn't apply to her, And now, there was something done to my kid's body that I couldn't undo no matter how angry I was about it. My husband walked in asking what smelled like cinnamon rolls, and the whole energy in the room shifted before he even finished the question, and she adjusted her whole face and voice and body language into something warm and grandmother. I'd seen her do it before when someone was about to catch her at something. I told my husband his mother had taken our daughter to get her ears pierced, and I said it fast before she could set the tone, before she could frame it as something sweet and thoughtful I was overreacting to, and he blinked at me, still half asleep, and asked me to repeat what I'd just said. His mother sighed and said she hadn't gone behind anyone's back, and that she'd done it because it was tradition and because our daughter was old enough, and that I'd been making it into a bigger issue than it needed to be anyway. My husband rubbed his face with both hands and said maybe we could talk about this later when everyone had calmed down, and the words hit me like cold water. I just stared at him for a second because I couldn't believe he'd said that, and he mentioned it being Christmas and keeping things peaceful for our daughter's sake. He thought this was just a disagreement we could postpone, like we were arguing about what time to serve dinner. I pulled out my phone and opened the text thread with his mother and scrolled back to the message I'd sent 2 months ago, and I read it out loud slowly, so he could hear every word and so she couldn't pretend it had been vague or unclear. The message said I appreciated the tradition, but we'd decided to wait on ear piercings until our daughter was old enough to choose for herself, and it ended with me asking her not to bring it up again. The room got very quiet after that, and something shifted in my chest, and his mother tried to recover and said she hadn't thought I was serious, that she'd assumed I was just being nervous the way I always was. My husband asked her directly if she'd seen that text, and she admitted she had, but said once the piercing was done, I'd see how lovely it looked and get over being worried about it. She said our daughter had been excited and asking questions, and that she'd made a decision she thought was best for everyone. He called our daughter back into the room and knelt down in front of her and asked her very gently to tell him about getting her ears pierced, and she looked confused and glanced at her grandmother like she was checking to see if she was in trouble. He asked if she had asked Grandma to take her, and she said she didn't know, that Grandma had said it was a surprise, and that it was special because all the ladies in the family do it. He asked if it hurt, and she nodded and said a little bit, that it still felt weird when she touched them, and he stood up and told his mother she'd crossed a line, and his voice was different than I had heard it before when he talked to her, firmer and less willing to bend. She tried to argue that our daughter had been perfectly fine with it and hadn't cried or made a fuss, but he cut her off. He said that wasn't the point, that she'd gone behind our backs and done something she knew we'd said no to. His mother's face flushed, and she said she had just as much right to be involved in our daughter's life as anyone else, and that she was tired of walking on eggshells every time she wanted to do something nice. I said this wasn't nice, and my voice came out harder than I meant it to, and I said she decided what she wanted mattered more than what we wanted, and that she'd used my daughter to prove a point. My husband told her she needed to leave, and the room went completely still, and she stared at him like she'd misheard and asked him to repeat himself, and he said it again, calmer, but just as firm. He said we needed time to figure things out and that having her there wasn't helping. My stomach tightened because I hadn't expected him to go that far, and she grabbed her coat and left without saying goodbye to our daughter, and the door closed harder than it needed to. My husband stood there staring at the empty space where she'd been, and his hands were shaking, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what would help. I wasn't sure yet if this was going to stick or if he'd change his mind once the shock wore off. Our daughter came back and asking if Grandma was mad at her because of the earrings, and I had to sit her down and explain in a way that wouldn't scare her, and I told her the earrings looked pretty, but that Grandma should have asked Mommy and Daddy first. I said sometimes grown-ups make mistakes even when they think they're being nice, and she asked if Grandma was in trouble, and I said something vague about everyone needing space to calm down. After I sent her upstairs to play, I found my husband standing in the kitchen with his hands braced on the counter, and I stood next to him, not touching him, just there, and neither of us said anything for a while. He finally said he couldn't believe she'd actually done it, that he'd known she could be pushy, but he hadn't thought she'd go that far. I wanted to say I'd been telling him that for years, but he looked so shaken I just nodded, and he straightened up and told me he was sorry he hadn't backed me up right away. He said he should have been on my side immediately, and he wasn't, and that it was on him. The apology landed somewhere between too late and appreciated, and I didn't know what to do with it yet, and I told him I just needed to know he saw it now, that he saw how she operated and how she didn't take no for an answer. He said he saw it, and that he didn't know how he'd missed it for so long. We spent the rest of Christmas pretending things were normal for our daughter, But every time I looked at those earrings, I felt sick, and they weren't just jewelry. They were proof my mother-in-law thought she could override me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily she'd done it. That night, after our daughter was asleep, I told my husband we needed to talk about what happened next, because letting this go wasn't an option, and he sat on the edge of the bed next to me and nodded like he'd been thinking the same thing. I said she couldn't have unsupervised time with our daughter anymore, and I kept my voice steady even though part of me was waiting for him to push back. He was quiet for a long time, and the silence felt heavy, because cutting off access felt extreme to him, even though it didn't feel extreme to me at all. He asked if I really thought that was necessary, and I said she'd proved it was necessary, and she hadn't just ignored what I'd said. She'd planned it and hidden it and done it on Christmas when she knew I'd have to stay calm. That wasn't a mistake. That was calculated, and I didn't see how we could trust her not to do something like that again. He exhaled slowly and said, "Okay, no more overnights and no more solo outings. And if she wanted to see our daughter, she could do it when one of us was there." I asked what would happen if she pushed back, and he said then she'd push back, but he wasn't changing his mind. I wanted to believe him, but there was still part of me that remembered how fast he'd tried to smooth things over that morning before he saw the text. I didn't say that out loud, though, because he was trying, and I didn't want to punish him for that. The next day, his mother called 3 times, and he didn't answer, and on the 4th call he picked up, and I could hear her voice through the speaker, high and insistent. He told her calmly we needed space, and we'd reach out when we were ready, and she tried to argue, and he repeated himself slower, and then he hung up. I watched him set the phone down, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. We had to clean and turn our daughter's earrings twice a day like the instructions said, and every time I did it, I felt this low anger that wouldn't go away. Our daughter asked once if we could take them out, and I explained we had to leave them in for a while so they could heal properly, and she accepted it the way kids accept things they don't understand yet. I thought about how she'd never get a choice about whether her ears were pierced in the first place. I kept wondering if maybe I was making too big a deal out of it, and they were just earrings and the piercing was clean and professional, and in a few months they'd be healed, and it would just be normal. Other people let their kids get their ears pierced young, and those kids were fine, and maybe I was being rigid about something that didn't actually matter that much in the long run. But then I'd remember the way my mother-in-law had sat there drinking her coffee after she'd done it, completely unbothered, and I'd remember the text I'd sent that she'd ignored. It wasn't about the earrings at all. It was about the fact that she thought my boundaries were suggestions she could work around if she disagreed with them. 2 weeks after Christmas, my husband's sister called asking what was going on because their mother had told her we were keeping our daughter away over something minor. I let him handle it, and I heard him explain the whole situation clearly without softening it, and his sister tried to say maybe we were overreacting, and he shut it down fast. He told her his mother had crossed a line, and we were handling it the way we needed to. His sister called me later that night to apologize, which surprised me, and she admitted their mother had a history of doing things like this, but everyone usually just let it go because fighting wasn't worth it. She said she was glad we weren't letting it go and that someone needed to draw a line eventually. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly less alone, but also aware I'd just made myself the bad guy in a family that didn't like conflict. My mother-in-law was going to tell everyone her version where I was controlling and overprotective and unreasonable, and there wasn't much I could do about that except not care. A month after Christmas, my mother-in-law sent a text asking if she could take our daughter to lunch, just the 2 of them, and I watched my husband type out a response saying visits needed to stay supervised for now. She wrote back asking when that would change, and he didn't answer. She tried again a week later with a different approach and asked if she could pick our daughter up from school one day to give us a break, and again he said no. It was hard for him to keep saying no, because she was his mother and he didn't like the distance, but he kept doing it anyway. The supervised visits started in February at neutral locations, and the first one was tense in a way that made my shoulders ache. We met at a park, even though it was cold, and my stomach tightened the second she pulled up, because I knew she'd have a strategy, and she barely looked at me and focused all her attention on our daughter. She asked about school and complimented her hair. She didn't mention the earrings once, which felt deliberate, like she was proving she could behave if we just gave her another chance. And my daughter played on the swings, and my mother-in-law sat on the bench talking quietly to my husband, and I stayed close enough to hear. Well, she said she didn't understand why things had to be so formal, that our daughter was her granddaughter, and she loved her. He said he knew that, but loving her didn't mean she got to override us as parents, and she said she'd made one tiny decision, and now she was being punished like a criminal. He said it hadn't been tiny to us and this wasn't punishment, it was a boundary. She went quiet and the silence stretched out, and then she sat back like she'd decided to wait instead of push, and my chest tightened because she hadn't given up, just switched tactics. About 2 months in, she tested the boundary in a way that made my hands go cold, and we were at another park visit, and my daughter needed to use the bathroom. My mother-in-law stood up fast and said she'd take her, that the bathroom was just across the parking lot, and we could wait at the bench, and I said I'd take her. She went very still for a second, and then smiled and sat back down. It was such a small thing offering to take a kid to the bathroom, but it wasn't small at all, and it was her checking to see if the rule was still real, or if we'd gotten soft enough to let it slide. My husband saw it too, and after the visit he said we'd made the right call keeping things supervised. The supervised visits kept going for months, and slowly it became the new normal, and my mother-in-law stopped asking when she could have our daughter overnight and started showing up on time with a carefully pleasant attitude that felt more like strategy than actual change. I told my husband I thought she was waiting us out, that she believed if she behaved long enough, we'd forget why we set the boundary in the first place. And he said maybe, but he wasn't forgetting, and he didn't. Our daughter adjusted faster than I expected, and she stopped asking why Grandma couldn't pick her up anymore, or why visits were always short. Kids accept new rules pretty easily when the adults around them are consistent, and she still loved her grandmother and enjoyed the visits, but the closeness that had been there before was gone, and I didn't try to rebuild. In April, my mother-in-law tested the boundary one more time, and she called and asked if our daughter could stay over for just one night because she missed having that special time with. My husband said no and explained again why the answer was no, and she got quiet for a long moment before saying she understood. I don't think she did understand, but she stopped asking after that. The earrings healed eventually, and one day our daughter asked if she could pick out new earrings to replace the gold studs, and I took her to the store and let her choose a pair with tiny butterflies on them. Watching her smile at herself in the mirror felt like taking back something small but important. My mother-in-law never apologized, not directly and not in a way that acknowledged what she'd actually done. And she said things like she was sorry I'd been upset and she hadn't meant for it to become such a big deal. Those weren't real apologies, and I stopped waiting for her to understand why it mattered. Some people will always choose their version of love over your boundaries, and when that happens, you don't owe them access just because they're family. My husband learned that keeping peace isn't the same as doing what's right, and he learned his mother's feelings weren't more important than our daughter's autonomy or my trust. It took longer than it should have, but he got there. Our daughter still wears earrings most days, and sometimes I wonder if she'll remember how it happened or if it'll just fade into background childhood memories. I hope she remembers we stood up for her even if it was messier than it should have been. The consequences weren't loud or dramatic, and there was no big blow-up after that first day, no severed relationships or public fallout. The consequence was distance, the quiet kind that changes how someone fits into your life without erasing them completely. My mother-in-law still sees our daughter, but she sees her on our terms now. And I learned boundaries aren't cruel, even when they're uncomfortable to enforce. Protecting my daughter sometimes means protecting her from people who love her but don't respect her. The gold studs are in a drawer somewhere, the ones we took out when her ears healed. I keep meaning to throw them away, but I haven't yet, and maybe they're a reminder, or maybe they're just earrings. If you've had to choose between keeping peace and protecting your kid, it's okay to choose your kid every time. Thanks for listening. And if this one resonated, I'd appreciate a like or subscribe. We've got new stories every day, so take care and I'll see you in the next one.